Hello, YouTube. Welcome to Level-Headed News. This is your host, Brenda, and I have some breaking news for you. There are two articles here about this. The first one here is off the Telegraph. Both of these URLs are in the description of the video if you want to pull them up to take a look at them. This says live, Brexit judgment live. Supreme Court rules against Theresa May by a majority of 8-3. And it starts out with the video there at the top of it, and it says, Judge rule against government by a majority of 8-3. Government must now bring forward legislation in Parliament. David Davis to make statement on the decision. Gina Miller condemns those in power for not calling out abuse. Corbyn to launch bid to send May's final Brexit deal back to Brussels. Article 50 ruling. When is it and what will it mean for Brexit? Following the judge's ruling live with all the latest reaction from the UK and Europe with comment and analysis. So you can pull that video up to take a look at that one. The next article here is off of the New York Times, and it says UK Parliament must approve start of Brexit talks, Supreme Court rules. And this is out of London. It says Prime Minister Theresa May must secure the approval of Parliament before she can begin the process of taking Britain out of the European Union, the Supreme Court ruled on Tuesday, which upholds an earlier decision by the High Court in London, creates another hurdle for Mrs. May, who has promised to begin a 2-year irreversible process of exit negotiations by the end of March by invoking the European Union's Article 50, the legal mechanism for leaving the bloc. Today, a majority of the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot trigger Article 50 without an act of Parliament authorizing it to do so, said David Neuberger, the Supreme Court president, in announcing the decision. A majority of lawmakers, including many from Mrs. May's Conservative Party, campaigned to stay in the European Union before the referendum last year, although most political observers said it was unlikely that the legislators would dare to reject the will of the voters who backed the withdrawal. In one important victory for the government, the court ruled that Mrs. May would not need to separate approval from the regional legislatures in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The devolution statutes were enacted on the assumption that the UK would be a member of the EU, but they do not require it, Lord Neuberger said. Relations with the EU are a matter for the UK government. Of the ruling, Jeremy Wright, Britain's Attorney General, issued a statement saying that the government would comply with the ruling. The case has underscored the polarizing nature of the June referendum, in which 52% of Britons voted to leave the European Union. Gina Miller, an investment fund manager, has said she was threatened with murder and rape by supporters of the Brexit, as Britain's decision is commonly known, who have accused her of trying to sabotage an exit. A lawyer by training, Ms. Miller has said she is merely standing up for the rights of Parliament. This case was about the legal process, not about politics, Ms. Miller said in a news conference outside the Supreme Court, where she thanked her law firm, Mishcon de Rea, for fighting her case. Ms. Miller said she had been the victim of a torrent of criticism since filing the case, and said she was shocked by the levels of personal abuse that I have received from many quarters over the last several months for simply bringing and asking a legitimate question. Even the judges have found themselves under immense pressure. Members of the High Court who ruled against the government in November, setting the stage for a Supreme Court decision, were described by one tabloid newspaper as enemies of the people. The ruling comes a week after Mrs. May first outlined her vision for a clean break with the European Union single market, one in which Britain would close its borders to visa-free migration for citizens from other countries in the bloc, a hard Brexit, as it is often referred to here. Under the terms of Article 50, the Prime Minister, who officially supports remaining in the bloc but expressed only trepid uh, support for it during the referendum campaign, has 2 years to complete exit negotiations once she invokes the rule. In her speech last week, Mrs. May pledged to give both houses of Parliament the opportunity to vote on any accord, but lawmakers from across the political spectrum have made clear that they want to be involved from the start. I and many others did not exercise our vote in the referendum so as to restore the sovereignty of this Parliament, only to see what we regard the tyranny of European Union replaced by that of a government, Stephen Phillips, a member of Mrs. May's Conservative Party, said when the case was first brought. If no deal is reached within 27 try that. If no deal is reached with 27 other member states once the 2-year countdown begins, or if Parliament rejects a final deal at that stage, it would most likely result in the sort of cliff edge breakup that Mrs. May, along with Britain's banksters and business leaders, hoped to avoid. Mrs. May's government had argued that under Britain's unwritten constitution, the leadership can make or leave international treaties without parliamentary approval. The High Court disagreed, ruling in November that it would be unlawful to use executive powers known as to start a process that would take rights away from citizens that had been granted by Parliament. Only Parliament could take those rights away, the court said. The government appealed the decision, taking the case to the Supreme Court, the country's highest judicial body, which came to its own conclusion after 4 days of hearings of injustices. Most legal commentators had predicted that the government would lose the case, and according to British news reports, officials have already started drafting parts of a bill that would be subject to parliamentary approval in a bid to the March timetable. If you like what I'm doing here, give it a thumbs up, share it on your social media so everybody gets to hear the news. Subscribe and click that little bell next to the subscription button and check that box. That way you'll get email alerts every time I put a show up and you'll stay informed.